power often reveals less about a person's character than the way they treat someone who has none. In the small frontier town of Red Creek, wealth was displayed openly. It gleamed from polished saddles, silver belt buckles, expensive boots, and the grand houses that stood beyond the dusty main street. But there were some things money could not purchase: dignity, kindness, and the courage to remain gentle when the world had given you every reason to become hard. On a bright autumn afternoon, the town's finest families gathered at the Red Creek Harvest Fair. Music drifted across the square. Children chased one another between wooden stalls, ladies in carefully chosen dresses admired embroidered linens, and wealthy ranchers stood beneath the shade of the courthouse veranda discussing cattle, land, and the year's profits. Among them was Daniel Whitmore. At 34, Daniel was the wealthiest ranch owner for miles around. His spread stretched across thousands of acres beyond the eastern hills, and people spoke his name with a mixture of admiration and caution. He was not a man who needed to raise his voice. When Daniel entered a room, conversations often became quieter on their own. He wore a dark brown riding coat over a cream shirt, his sleeves fastened neatly at the wrists. His black hat rested low above steady grey eyes, and his expression carried the controlled reserve of a man who had learned long ago that trust was something to be earned. Yet that afternoon, Daniel was not watching the auctioneer. He was watching a young woman standing near the far edge of the square. Her name was Clara Bell. Most people in Red Creek knew her as the widow's daughter. Her mother, Margaret Bell, had been left with little after her husband's death 3 years earlier. Their small farm produced enough to survive, but never enough to impress anyone. Clara had spent most of her life repairing what others discarded, wearing dresses altered from older ones and working from dawn until evening beside her mother. That afternoon, she wore a simple cream-colored dress beneath a faded blue shawl, and on her feet were a pair of old brown shoes. The leather had cracked near the toes. One heel had been repaired with a strip of darker leather. Clara knew they were worn. She simply had no others. She had come to the fair because her mother had asked her to sell a basket of preserves. Nothing more. But as she crossed the square, 3 young women near the fountain noticed her shoes. One covered her mouth. Another whispered something that made the others laugh. Clara heard them. She stopped for half a second. Her fingers tightened around the basket. Then she continued walking. That was what Daniel noticed. Not the laughter. Not even the shoes. He noticed that Clara had heard every cruel word and still refused to give those people the satisfaction of seeing her break. A moment later, one of the young women called after her, "Miss Bell, surely those shoes have seen better days." The laughter grew louder. Several people turned. Clara slowly looked back. Her face remained composed, but the color had risen in her cheeks. "I suppose they have," she answered quietly. Another girl smiled. "Perhaps your mother should buy you a new pair." Clara lowered her eyes. "My mother has more important things to spend money on." The answer silenced them for only a moment. Then someone laughed again. Daniel's expression changed. He had heard people mock poverty before, but there was something about Clara's answer that stayed with him. She had defended her mother without defending herself. She had chosen dignity over anger, and Daniel could not understand why. He watched as Clara carried her basket toward the market stalls. Then a gust of wind swept through the square. Her basket tipped. Several glass jars rolled across the dusty ground. Clara immediately dropped to her knees to gather them. People stepped around her. Some laughed. Some simply continued walking. No one stopped. Except Daniel. He stepped away from the courthouse veranda. And as he approached the young woman kneeling alone in the dust, Clara looked up, unaware that the richest man in Red Creek was about to do something that would make the entire town question what he had seen in her that afternoon. Daniel crouched beside Clara without saying a word. A jar had rolled beneath the wooden platform of a nearby stall. He reached beneath it, retrieved the jar, and placed it carefully into her basket. Clara stared at him. She recognized him immediately. Everyone in Red Creek did. Mr. Whitmore. Daniel handed her another jar. "Miss Bell." His voice was calm, almost gentle. Clara looked down at the basket. "You needn't trouble yourself." "I know." He picked up another jar. "Then why are you helping me?" Daniel paused. "Because you need help." It was such a simple answer that Clara did not know how to respond. Around them, the square had become strangely quiet. The women who had laughed moments earlier were watching. So were the ranchers, shopkeepers, and several of Daniel's business associates. Nobody expected the richest man in the county to kneel in the dust beside the widow's daughter. Daniel stood once the last jar had been collected. He looked toward the 3 women near the fountain. None of them met his eyes. Then he turned back to Clara. Are all of these still intact? She inspected the basket. Yes. Good. He picked up the heavier end of the basket. I'll carry it. Clara immediately reached for it. I can manage. I believe you. He did not release the basket. But you shouldn't have to. Something in those words unsettled her. Not because they were romantic. They weren't. They were simply considerate. And Clara had become so accustomed to managing everything herself that being offered help felt almost suspicious. They walked toward the market stall together. People moved aside. Clara could feel their eyes following them. She wished they would stop. Daniel seemed completely unaware of the attention. Or perhaps he simply did not care. At the stall, Clara arranged the jars carefully. Daniel remained nearby. How much? She looked at him. For what? The preserves. You don't need to buy them. I wasn't asking whether I needed them. His expression softened slightly. I'm asking how much they cost. Clara hesitated. 20 cents a jar. Daniel looked at the basket. Then I'll take all of them. Her eyes widened. All. All. But you don't need 12 jars of blackberry preserves. I have a ranch. That almost made her smile. A ranch doesn't explain 12 jars. Daniel's mouth curved faintly. No. But hungry ranch hands do. Clara accepted the money only after he insisted. As he turned away, she called after him. Mr. Whitmore. He stopped. Thank you. Daniel looked back at her. For the jars. She shook her head. For not laughing. His expression changed. For the first time that afternoon, the guardedness in his eyes disappeared. No one should have to thank someone for that. Then he walked away. Clara watched him disappear into the crowd. She told herself it meant nothing. Yet something about the encounter remained with her. Daniel, meanwhile, returned to the courthouse veranda, where his foreman, Samuel Carter, was waiting. You bought every jar. Daniel nodded. Samuel looked amused. Since when do you eat blackberry preserves? I don't. Then what are you going to do with them? Daniel glanced toward Clara. Give them to the ranch hands. Samuel followed his gaze. You noticed her. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. I noticed what everyone else ignored. Before Samuel could answer, a familiar voice interrupted them. Daniel. It belonged to Charles Mercer, one of the wealthiest merchants in town. He approached with a polished smile. I heard you were buying out half the market. Daniel said nothing. Charles lowered his voice. Be careful. The Bell family has a reputation. Daniel turned toward him. What reputation? Charles hesitated. Margaret Bell's husband left debts when he died. I know. Some people say he took money he couldn't repay. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Some people say many things. Charles smiled awkwardly. I only thought you should know. Daniel stepped closer. I already know enough to understand that gossip isn't evidence. Charles's smile disappeared. Across the square, Clara had heard none of this. She was packing the empty basket when an older woman approached. Clara. Mrs. Dawson, the town seamstress, lowered her voice. Your mother asked me to tell you something. What? She wants you home before sunset. Clara's expression changed. Did she say why? Mrs. Dawson shook her head. Only that someone came to the farm asking questions about your father. Clara went still. Her father had been dead for 3 years. Why would anyone suddenly be asking about him now? And why had her mother sounded frightened? Clara hurried toward the road. But before she could leave the square, she noticed Daniel standing beside his horse. He was watching her. Not intrusively. Concerned. Their eyes met. Daniel seemed about to speak. Then Clara turned away. She had no idea that the questions about her father were connected to a secret buried beneath Red Creek's respectable surface. and she certainly did not know that Daniel had already heard the same name that afternoon, a name his own family had tried to erase from their records for more than a decade. By the time Clara reached the Bell farm, the sun had begun to sink behind the western hills. The little house stood beyond a narrow stretch of pasture, its white paint faded by years of wind and dust. A wooden fence surrounded the garden, though several posts leaned badly and one section had been repaired with rope. Clara pushed open the front door. "Mother." Margaret Bell was sitting at the kitchen table. She looked up quickly. "You came." Clara stopped. Her mother was usually composed, even when money was scarce. But tonight there was fear in her eyes. Mrs. Dawson said someone had been asking about father. Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "She shouldn't have frightened you." "Who was it?" "No one important." "Mother." The older woman looked away. Clara had inherited her father's patience, but not his willingness to accept silence. Who was asking? Margaret remained quiet for several moments. Then she whispered, "A man from the Whitmore ranch." Clara felt a strange chill. "Mr. Whitmore?" "No." Her mother shook her head. "Someone who works for him." Clara remembered Daniel's face at the fair. He had seemed honorable, but perhaps there were things she knew nothing about. What did he want? "Your father's old papers." "Why?" "I don't know." "You do know." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I know only that your father was afraid during the last weeks of his life." Clara sat opposite her. Afraid of whom? Margaret looked toward the window. The Whitmores. Silence settled between them. For years, Clara had heard only fragments about the feud between her father and Daniel Whitmore's family. Her father had once worked for the Whitmores. Then something had happened. He had left their employment. After that, the family stopped speaking. No one ever explained why. Clara had never pressed her mother because grief had already taken so much from her. But now the past seemed to be returning. Before she could ask another question, hoofbeats sounded outside. Margaret's face went pale. "Who is that?" Clara moved toward the window. A rider was approaching. But it wasn't a stranger. It was Daniel Whitmore. He dismounted near the fence and removed his hat. Clara opened the door before he reached it. "Mr. Whitmore." "I apologize for coming unannounced." His eyes moved briefly toward Margaret. "I wanted to speak with both of you." Margaret stood slowly. "About what?" Daniel took a folded document from his coat. "Your husband." Margaret's face tightened. "You have no right." "I know." Daniel placed the document on the table. "That's why I came here instead of sending someone." Clara looked down. The paper carried an old Whitmore seal. "What is it?" "My father's private ledger." Margaret stared at it. "I found your husband's name inside." "After 3 years." "I didn't know it existed until yesterday." Clara looked up. "Why are you telling us now?" Daniel hesitated. "Because someone has been searching for the same records." Margaret's expression changed. "Who?" "I don't know." That answer seemed to trouble Daniel more than it reassured them. He opened the ledger. Several entries had been marked with dates and initials. Clara leaned closer. Then she saw her father's handwriting. Her breath caught. "This is his." Daniel nodded. "My father accused yours of stealing from the ranch." Margaret closed her eyes. "He didn't." "I believe you." The words came quietly, but they carried enormous weight. Daniel continued. "My father died believing your husband had betrayed him." Margaret looked toward him. "Then why do you believe otherwise?" Daniel turned another page. "Because the numbers don't make sense." He pointed to a series of payments. Money was removed from my father's accounts and then entered into another account. "Whose?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I haven't found out yet." Clara studied the page. There was something familiar about the handwriting beside one of the entries. Not her father's. Someone else's. She suddenly remembered a name her father had once whispered when he thought she was asleep. Mercer. Daniel looked at her sharply. "What did you say?" "Charles Mercer." The room went silent. Daniel slowly closed the ledger. "Why would your father mention him?" "I don't know." Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass. Then Daniel heard something. A horse. Another rider was approaching the farm. He stepped toward the window. A dark figure had stopped beyond the fence. The rider did not dismount. He simply watched the house. Daniel's expression hardened. "Stay inside." Clara moved toward him. "Who is it?" "I don't know." The rider suddenly turned his horse and disappeared into the darkness. Daniel stared after him. Someone had followed him. And now they knew exactly where Clarabelle lived. For the first time, Daniel understood that the broken shoes, the whispered accusations, and the old feud were not separate pieces of Clara's life. They were connected. And someone was desperate to make certain the truth remained buried. The following morning, Red Creek woke beneath a sky the color of cold steel. News traveled quickly in a town where secrets rarely survived a single night. By breakfast, people were already whispering that Daniel Whitmore had visited the Bell farm. By noon, the story had changed. Some claimed Daniel had gone there to demand repayment of an old debt. Others insisted Margaret Bell had finally admitted what her husband had done. And by afternoon, one particularly cruel version suggested that Clara had deliberately attracted Daniel's attention at the harvest fair. Clara heard the whispers while purchasing flour at the general store. She kept her eyes lowered. She had learned that defending herself against every rumor only gave rumors a longer life. But when she stepped outside, she found Daniel waiting beside his horse. He removed his hat. "Miss Bell." She stopped. "Did you come to speak with me?" "Yes." "About my father?" "Partly." Daniel glanced toward the street. Someone entered the Whitmore office last night. Clara's stomach tightened. "Did they steal the ledger?" "No." "Then what did they take?" "Nothing." Daniel's voice became quieter. "They searched for something." Clara looked at him. "What?" "I don't know." He paused. "But they knew exactly where my father's private records were kept." Clara folded her hands. "Could it have been the rider from last night?" "Perhaps." "And you think he was looking for my father's papers?" "I think someone is afraid of what those papers might reveal." Clara looked toward the road. "Then why are you telling me?" "Because you may be in danger." She almost smiled. "Mr. Whitmore, I have been poor for years. I have survived gossip, debt, and grief. I am not certain danger is something I can afford to be frightened of." Daniel stuttered her. "That is precisely what worries me." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" "You have become accustomed to carrying burdens alone." The words struck deeper than she expected. Before she could answer, a carriage stopped nearby. Charles Mercer stepped down. He wore an expensive black coat and carried a silver-handled cane. His eyes moved from Daniel to Clara. "Mr. Whitmore." Daniel's expression became cold. "Mr. Mercer." Charles smiled. "Miss Bell." Clara nodded politely. Charles looked toward Daniel. "I hope you're not encouraging the Bells to reopen old wounds." Daniel's voice was controlled. "I don't take advice from men who arrive after the damage is done." Charles's smile disappeared. "You should be careful." "About what?" "Some families have a habit of bringing misfortune wherever they go." Clara's face tightened. Daniel stepped between them. "Choose your next words carefully." Charles looked at him for several seconds. Then he smiled again. "I see." He glanced at Clara. "Perhaps you've already chosen your side." He climbed back into his carriage. When it disappeared down the road, Clara looked at Daniel. "You didn't have to defend me." "Yes, I did." "Why?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was becoming uncomfortable. He had spent years believing the Bell family had ruined his father's reputation. Yet the more he learned, the less certain he became. And Clara herself was making that uncertainty impossible to ignore. "You remind me of someone," he finally said. "Who?" "My mother." Clara was surprised. Daniel rarely spoke about his family. She was kind. She was. He looked toward the distant hills. Too kind, perhaps. What happened to her? Daniel's jaw tightened. She trusted the wrong person. Clara understood then that his emotional scars ran deeper than she had realized. "Is that why you don't trust people?" "Some." And me. Daniel looked directly at her. I haven't decided. It should have offended her. Instead, she found herself strangely relieved by the honesty. That evening, Daniel returned to his ranch. He spent hours examining his father's records. Then he found something. A payment dated 2 weeks before Clara's father resigned. The recipient's name had been scratched away, but beneath the damaged ink was a partial letter. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Mercer. He searched another ledger. Then another. Finally, he found a transaction that made his blood run cold. Money had been transferred from his father's account to an account controlled by Charles Mercer, and the transfer had been authorized by someone using the initials of Daniel's own older brother. Daniel leaned back slowly. His brother had been dead for 7 years. He had never been suspected of anything, unless someone had used his name. Daniel suddenly understood why the old accusation had been so convenient. Someone had needed a scapegoat, and Clara's father had discovered the truth. That explained everything. But one question remained. Why had Clara's father never exposed Charles Mercer? Daniel rode back toward the Bell Farm that same night. He found Clara outside, hanging laundry beneath the moonlight. She looked surprised to see him. Mr. Whitmore. Daniel dismounted. I found something. What? Your father may not have stolen anything. Clara's hands went still. For 3 years, she had carried the shame of an accusation she never believed. Now Daniel was telling her that the accusation might have been a lie. Then who did it? I believe Charles Mercer was involved. Clara stared at him. Daniel stepped closer. But there's something else. What? Your father knew. She swallowed. How? I don't know. Daniel looked toward the dark road. But I think he left something behind. Clara's heart began to pound. Where? Daniel's eyes returned to hers. That's what I intend to find out. Before either could say another word, the sound of breaking glass came from inside the house. Clara turned sharply. Daniel drew his pistol. Someone was inside. And this time, they had not come looking for the ledger. They had come looking for Clara. The sound of breaking glass had barely faded when Daniel reached for Clara's arm. Stay behind me. She obeyed. For once, she did not argue. The front door of the Bell House stood open. Inside, a lamp had been knocked from the table, and fragments of glass glittered across the floor. Mother! Clara rushed forward, but Daniel caught her before she crossed the threshold. Wait! He listened. Nothing. Then came a faint sound from the kitchen. A drawer opening. Daniel entered first. Clara followed close behind. The kitchen was empty. The back door, however, stood wide open. On the floor beside it lay a small wooden box. Clara stared at it. I've never seen that before. Daniel crouched and examined the box. There was a name carved into its lid. Thomas Bell. Clara's breath caught. My father's. Daniel opened it carefully. Inside was a folded letter, several receipts, and a small brass key. Clara reached for the letter. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her father's. Margaret, if anything happens to me, tell Clara that I never betrayed the Whitmores. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Daniel read the rest silently. Thomas had discovered that Charles Mercer was secretly purchasing land belonging to struggling farmers. He had been using false debts and manipulated records to force families to sell their properties for almost nothing. The money had been moved through accounts connected to the Whitmore ranch. Thomas had tried to expose him. That was why he had been accused of stealing. But there was more. At the bottom of the letter, Thomas had written, "The proof is where Daniel's mother used to keep the family correspondence." Daniel went completely still. My mother. Clara looked at him. Where? Daniel's expression had changed. At Whitmore House. They left immediately. By midnight, Daniel and Clara were riding toward the ranch. For the first time, Clara rode beside him rather than behind. The moon illuminated the wide plains, and the silence between them felt different now. Not uncomfortable. Almost trusting. You believed my father, Clara said quietly. I believe the evidence. She looked at him. And me. Daniel glanced toward her. I believe you too. Those 4 words meant more to Clara than she wanted to admit. When they reached the ranch, Daniel led her into the old library. His mother's belongings had remained untouched for years. He opened an antique writing desk and searched through several compartments. Nothing. Then Clara noticed the brass key. "Try that." Daniel looked at her. He inserted the key into a small lock hidden beneath the desk. A compartment opened. Inside were dozens of letters. Daniel picked up the first one. Then another. Most concerned ordinary family matters. But one envelope bore Charles Mercer's name. Daniel opened it. His father's handwriting appeared across the page. The letter accused Mercer of falsifying accounts and warned that Thomas Bell had discovered everything. Daniel's face hardened. There was finally proof. But Clara noticed something else. A second letter had been written by Daniel's older brother. It contained a confession. He admitted that Mercer had threatened him into signing several documents using his father's authority. He had intended to confess, but he died before he could. Daniel closed his eyes. For years, he had believed his brother had died an honorable man who had simply been unlucky. Now he understood that his brother had carried guilt until the end. Clara placed a hand gently on Daniel's arm. He looked at her. "Your brother tried to correct it." "Too late." "Perhaps." She paused. "But he tried." Daniel looked down at her hand. She slowly withdrew it. Neither spoke. Then footsteps sounded outside the library. Daniel turned. The door opened. Charles Mercer stood there. 2 armed men were behind him. "You've been very busy," Mercer said. Daniel stepped in front of Clara. "You should have left Red Creek years ago." Mercer smiled. "And surrender everything I built." "You built it on stolen land." "Prove it." Daniel lifted the letters. "I can." Mercer's smile disappeared. "Then you'll have to survive long enough to show them." One of the men raised his weapon. Clara suddenly noticed something on the table. The brass key. She remembered her father's letter. The proof was not the letters. It was what the letters pointed toward. She looked at the old fireplace. Then she understood. Daniel. He followed her gaze. Behind the fireplace mantel was a narrow compartment. Daniel moved quickly. Mercer shouted. But Clara reached it first. Inside was a bundle of original land deeds. Hundreds of acres. Documents proving that Mercer had forged signatures and transferred ownership illegally. The evidence was undeniable. Mercer stared at them. His confidence vanished. Daniel stepped toward him. "It ends tonight." Mercer looked at Clara. "You." She met his furious stare without lowering her eyes. "You thought poverty made us powerless." Her voice was quiet. "But you were wrong." Daniel took the documents. By morning, the sheriff had arrested Mercer and his associates. The truth spread through Red Creek faster than any rumor ever had. Thomas Bell's name was cleared. Margaret no longer had to live beneath the shadow of an accusation. Families whose land had been stolen came forward with their own evidence. Within weeks, Mercer lost everything. But for Clara, the greatest change was quieter. One afternoon, she stood outside the Whitmore house. Daniel approached carrying a small wooden box. He handed it to her. Inside was a new pair of brown leather shoes. Clara stared at them. "I don't need charity." Daniel smiled. "I know." She looked up. "Then why?" "Because I wanted to give you something." "Why?" Daniel was silent for a moment. "Because the first thing I noticed about you wasn't your shoes." Clara's expression softened. "What was it?" "That you were kind when nobody was watching." She looked away, suddenly unable to hide her smile. Daniel continued. "You didn't need my money. You didn't need my protection. And you certainly didn't need me to tell you your worth." He stepped closer. "But if you'll allow me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life reminding you of it." Clara looked into his eyes. The guarded man who had once trusted almost no one was standing before her without defenses. "I think," she whispered, "I would like that." Months later, Clara and Daniel married beneath the old oak trees overlooking the Whitmore fields. Margaret sat proudly among the guests. The people who had once laughed at Clara's broken shoes watched her walk toward the man who had chosen her for something money could never buy. Not beauty. Not wealth. Not status. Character. And Clara never forgot the lesson that had begun in a dusty marketplace. Sometimes the smallest kindness changes a person's life. And sometimes, when the world expects you to look away, choosing to see someone is the beginning of everything.